Welcome to tonight's Simon Wiesenthal lecture. Simon Wiesenthal's idea on this institute was not to have a research institute only or exclusively on the rather narrow historiographical aspects of the history of the Holocaust. While together with historians elaborating the concept of more or less his Shoah Research Center, he always stressed to open up the institute's work towards broader aspects, opening it up towards the documentation, research of racism, anti-Semitism, the antecedents of the Holocaust itself and other genocides, wanted the aspects of memorialization included into his work or to the work of the Institute. In doing so, states the mission statement of VWI, it will play an important role in raising public awareness and contributing to the struggle against indifference in the face of crimes against humanity. Carrying out this idea of Simon Wiesenthal, we from the Institute always wanted and still want to include all these aspects in our regular Simon Wiesenthal lecture series and constantly try to present different classical or more or less innovative approaches to these themes. Try to present and introduce new topics and showing with that the wide variety and the research possibilities in the still relatively young and or new field. History, as we learned, knows a long durée. Structures, mentalities, behaviors deeply rooted in the past can hardly or only in a very, very hard way be changed, haunt, in a way, our present. With today's lectures, we will really go back into very past times, and we will learn about the attitudes of the Hungarian political elite towards religious and ethnic minorities from the Middle Ages to the early modern times up to today. We will learn about the processes of integration, protection, and writes about questions of inclusion and exclusion in, for us, very remote times, all the ideas Simon Wiesenthal wanted to have in this institute. But nevertheless, these ideas still influence the contemporary history and even more today's attitudes in our neighboring country, Hungary, which in many ways momentarily causes so many worries and so many disquiet among us. Now let me introduce our speaker today, Nóra Berend. She's a senior lecturer at the Faculty of History at the University of Cambridge. She's currently working on historical constructions of identity in medieval and modern Hungary. Her earlier publications include the highly acclaimed and recently translated into Hungarian book, At the Gate of Christendom, Jews, Muslims, and Pagans in Medieval Hungary, and she recently co-authored Central Europe in the High Middle Ages, Bohemia, Hungary, and Poland. Welcome to Vienna, and the floor is yours.
Vielen Dank für diese Einladung. Es tut mir leid, aber ich spreche sehr schlimm Deutsch und werde Englisch sprechen. So, let me start with today. Current government discourse in Hungary distinguishes between Jews and Hungarians emulating and competing with the far right. To give you a few examples, János Lázár, Secretary of State for the Prime Minister's Office and also responsible for overseeing the Holocaust commemoration year in 2014, first assured the public that Prime Minister Viktor Orbán wished to respond to all our Hungarian compatriots and Jewish co-citizens on the controversial German occupation memorial, then accused Mozsehis, the Federation of Hungarian Jewish Communities, which is the largest umbrella organization for Jewish communities in Hungary, of sabotaging the Holocaust commemoration year, and declared that the ultimatum by Mozsehis worries several people and does not influence in the right direction the coexistence of Jews and Hungarians, which had been a success during several centuries in the Carpathian Basin. As proof of this success, one of the commentators acerbically cited one of the last blood libels of Europe and the extermination of close to 500,000 Jews with the active participation of the Hungarian government, the Hungarian state. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán himself affirmed that he wanted to ensure the safety of all his Jewish co-citizens in Hungary. He explained antisemitism as deriving from an inferiority complex. Many people think that the Jews are stronger than they and can therefore harm them. They have no intention of harming us. I explain to people that it is forbidden for us to see Jews as a danger. Rather, we need to see them as the gift of God. Speaking in such a manner, Orbán wields the pernicious terminology of us, Hungarians, versus them, Jews. In addition, defending the German occupation memorial against critics, he wrote a letter intending it to be an open letter, so published, on how the Archangel Gabriel, the main figure of the statue, symbolizes all the victims of Nazism and not Hungary, as critics said. Now you can see the memorial when it was put up and still protected by fences and also police, and the kind of counter memorial of the commemoration in front of it. This is a closer up. You can see the figure of the Archangel Gabriel being attacked by the Nazi eagle. And you can see that this Gabriel is holding the orb with a double-barreled cross. So that's, I will talk more about that, the symbol of the Hungarian state. You can see the face of the angel here. Sort of, the orb is more or less falling out of his hand. So, according to the Prime Minister, Gabriel is a particularly appropriate representation of the victims because he restitutes the surplus in the representation of the destructive evil that other solutions would be incapable of rendering. I am thinking of anti-Christianity. Because the Nazis destroyed Christian values, and so all the victims, whether they are of the faith of the Old Testament, Christians, or faithless, were the victims of a dictatorship that was the personification of an anti-Christian tendency. Jews, rather than primary targets of Nazism, are present among the victims almost incidentally. Worse, when the Prime Minister acknowledged Hungarian collaboration, relativizing it very heavily, claiming that collaboration with the Nazis was equally widespread everywhere in Europe, at the same time, he rejected true responsibility and indeed started blaming Jews in a code. There would have been no deportation without a German occupation. If one does not admit that, it is difficult to imagine a sincere coexistence in the future founded on trust. Our generation became the partisan of radically anti-communist politics because we had enough of lies built on distrust. The unspoken presence in this text are the Jews. Communism, in certain right-wing speech, of course, is linked to the Jews, and the whole period after World War II is thus attributed to the Jews. This period of lies and distrust refers to that. The key message of this letter is, therefore, that Jews are liars and must admit that Hungarian society, in the final analysis, is not responsible for the Holocaust. Without that, they will endanger their future existence in Hungary, in a Christian Hungary, of course. Jarringly clashing with modern ideas of citizenship and a carrier of antisemitism, the dichotomy of Jews versus Hungarians raises questions about its historical roots. How far back can we trace the distinction between Jews and Hungarians? And what precedents do we find for state-sponsored antisemitism? Because what the Hungarian government is deploying is political antisemitism in the service of garnering popular support, even if ever so often various government functionaries claim that this is not the case, and Orbán presents himself as a champion against antisemitism. I shall therefore investigate here the role of political authority over time in creating policies towards the Jewish population of Hungary. My discussion will be avowedly one-sided. the Jews as subjects, or rather objects, of state policy, are the constructs of the state. This is also relatively apparent in the numbers, because the Jewish population of Hungary was always a very small minority. In the medieval period between the 11th and 13th century, so small that they were about 0.05% of the population. We, of course, do not really have statistics, reliable statistics, before the very end of the 19th century, so all these numbers are hypothetical, but nonetheless, we can be quite sure that it was a very, very small minority. And of course, even in the early 20th century, the Jewish population of Hungary was about 5% of the population. Now, in reality, people who identified themselves as Jewish in Hungary were never a monolithic group. And were we to focus on the Jewish stances towards the Hungarian state, we would find many different attitudes. I shall focus, however, on the state in various periods and how the state conceptualized and treated its Jewish inhabitants. I should emphasize at the start that the nature of the state itself changed over time. The faceless bureaucracy we associate with the state is a modern phenomenon. The medieval state operated through personal ties. Power and personal bonds and the competition for the right to wield violence distinguish it from its modern counterparts. The medieval Kingdom of Hungary was a vast realm of many different peoples who spoke various languages and had a diverse variety of legal statuses. The king governed together with the high nobility. Power was much more personalized, and many of the familiar features of modern states did not yet exist. The medieval period was characterized by a fragile type of integration of the Jews. In order to understand it, I should emphasize at the beginning that the framework for Jewish life was very different from the modern period. First of all, in the Middle Ages, being a Jew meant adhering to Judaism. Religious adhesion was primary in medieval categorizations. Second, three different sources of power coexisted, and political life, and hence the status of Jews in the medieval Kingdom of Hungary, was determined by the balance between those three, namely royal power, ecclesiastical power, which itself comprised of two aspects: local ecclesiastics, like bishops and archbishops of Hungary, and the papacy that these ecclesiastics could call on, and thirdly, the nobility. And finally, the Jews were not the only group with their own legal status in Hungary, and they were not even the only non-Christian group with their own status. There were Muslims, and there were groups that Christians called pagans. The kings of Hungary started to legislate about Jewish status from the time of King Ladislas I, 1077 to 95, and during his reign and the reign of his successor, King Koloman, 1095 to 1116, the approach was purely religious. It was the religious divide between Jews and Christians that necessitated the regulation of the place of Jews in Christian society. The royal legislation followed earlier models and emulated various ecclesiastical restrictions. Yet, in comparison to contemporary medieval legislation in Western Europe, measures aimed at segregation played a minor role. Intermarriage between Christian women and Jewish men was forbidden, as was the buying of non-kosher meat from Jews, and this meat was described in the Christian legislation as meat that the Jews despised. Jews were to be prevented from engaging in activities deemed offensive for Christians, such as trading on Sunday or on Christian holy days, and holding Christian slaves. All these regulations, in the final instance, derived from the Christian Catholic theological idea that Christians, redeemed by the blood of Christ, could not be in any way under the power of Jews, because Jews were seen as cast off by God when they did not recognize the Messiah, in favor of Christians who became the new chosen people. So that is why, for example, you find this not buying the meat they despise. So anything that can be construed as Jews exercising power over Christians was to be prohibited. Finally, credit and trade transactions were regulated. Coleman even tried to introduce the compulsory use of written charters in such interactions. So this legislation integrated Jews into the kingdom as holders of a specific legal status, a status that entailed exclusionary aspects derived from Christian notions of the relative standing of Jews and Christians, while allowing settlement and economic activity. Being a Jew meant a specific legal status, and in the Kingdom of Hungary, that status was also conceived of as the status of a hospes or guest. Now, that's a technical term in the medieval period. It referred to immigrants coming from outside or immigrants moving around within the kingdom but settling in a new territory, and it gave certain kinds of rights and protection to such guests. And I should say that Christians themselves could be guests in this context. From the perspective of Christianity, however, Jews could never be fully integrated as Jews, only if they converted to Christianity. As long as they remained Jews, and I have to say the expectation was that finally, ultimately, all Jews would convert to Christianity, but as long as they remained Jews, they were set apart by their faith. Christian-Jewish interaction was to be limited, and Christian superiority was clearly expressed. At the same time, protection was to be granted to Jews within the frameworks laid down by the legislation. Since Christianity in medieval Europe was not a matter of private choice, but a compulsory state religion, ecclesiastical ideas became part of the fabric of political authority. No separate religious sphere existed, but the meaning and the interpretation of the appropriate behavior from a Christian point of view was open to contestation. Royal legislation followed ecclesiastical ideas, even if in a mitigated way, until the 13th century. A change then came in the 13th century linked to royal interests. King Andrew II, 1205 to 1235, and his son, Bela IV, 1235 to 70, dodged or confronted ecclesiastical authority, the Archbishop of Esztergom and the Pope, in their persistence to employ non-Christians, Jews and Muslims, as their officials. Canon law, therefore Christian ecclesiastical law, prohibited the employment of non-Christians with power over Christians in public office. So this derived from the same idea of Jews not having power over Christians. The kings of Hungary, however, were more interested in ensuring the reform of their system of revenues, now based on the farming out of revenues, that is, leasing out customs duties, minting, and other monetary revenues, which now replaced revenues from the landed estates of the kings. That was the previous system, so kings basically collected their revenues in kind. But Andrew II started giving away territories and was trying to reform the system to a kind of monetary revenue system. Taxes and customs duties were collected by the lessees. In this way, kings employed Jews and Muslims in public offices, that is, in roles connected to the treasury and mint. In other words, public office in this period meant being a royal official, including leasing out royal revenues. Contestation brought together the nobility with ecclesiastics to put pressure on the kings. Nobles wanted to safeguard their positions in the kingdom and exclude competition. The Archbishop Robert of Esztergom was both jealous of his profits in the sale of salt and objected to the infringement of canon law. Clashes with the church were followed by royal promises in the Golden Bull in 1222 and the Oath of Berend, 1233, not to appoint Jews and Muslims to positions of the Count of the Treasury, to positions in the mint, to oversee the trade of salt, or to be in charge of customs duties. And in the 1231 renewal of the Golden Bull, all these were grouped together as public offices, so clearly all these positions were interpreted as holding public office. Such promises, however, were not kept, and Bela IV then submitted a well-researched request referring to papal approval of such practices in Portugal to allow non-Christians in positions of public offices in 1239. So that was a pretty clever trick that, of course, the king did not personally engineer, but one of the canon lawyers in royal service must have done the research, because basically this letter asked Pope Gregory IX to authorize the employment of these non-Christians, stating correctly that the same Pope, Gregory IX, had already authorized such a thing to Sancho II, the King of Portugal. So it was quite difficult to argue against this, since the Pope himself already gave such a permission. Papal reproaches continued for the continued employment of non-Christians. So we have recurring papal reproaches in the later 13th century. The kings of Hungary clearly placed their economic and political interests above the papal interpretations of Christian requirements. Bela IV innovated in another way as well, issuing a Charter of Privileges in 1251, modeled on the Austrian Charter of Duke Frederick of Austria, which was issued in 1244, to the Jews of Hungary. Because the Jewish elite at the time moved between Austria and Hungary, the initiative certainly came from them. Privileges in the Middle Ages, I should add, did not mean especially unduly positive status compared to that of others, but rather the guaranteed protection and rights in return for specific duties of a particular group. These privileges were quite comprehensive and included physical protection from attack by Christians through fining those who violated these regulations, so for injuring or killing a Jew, for raping a Jewish woman, and kidnapping Jewish children. Synagogues also came under royal protection. Compensation was ordered to be paid not only to the Jewish victims, but also to the king. So in each case, there was a compensation to be paid to the king, signaling that Jewish status was linked to royal claims over the Jews. Jewish religious practices were also protected. For example, they were not to be forced to return pawned goods on holy days, or to swear on the Torah for insignificant matters, or to pay customs duties when transporting their dead. Jews were also able to have recourse to three means of proof in litigation: Jewish witnesses, an oath on the Torah, and the judicial duel if a Jew was killed in secret, but the identity of the killer was suspected. Cooperating with Christians, Jews were able to have recourse to the judicial duel in other cases as well. The Jewish oath itself is an indicator of integrative or exclusionary intentions. The basic premise of Christian attitudes to oaths in the Middle Ages by adherents of other faiths was distrust. So Christians attempted to ensure that the oath would be binding on those taking it. Now, if you read medieval texts, you will see that Jews were frequently considered to be perfidious in the Christian sources, but no more faith was accorded to other non-Christians. It was a recurring topos that the word of a non-Christian cannot be trusted. So the basic intention is to deceive Christians, and Christians somehow have to guard against that. Because it was divine vengeance that the oath taker called down on themselves if they broke the oath. Clearly, an oath was considered binding if it was taken on something that was considered sacred by the person taking the oath. So an oath taken on a divinity one did not believe in would not ensure this outcome. And this posed a problem for Christians, how to ensure the validity of non-Christian oaths. So they devised various ways of ensuring that the non-Christian side took an oath on something that they would consider binding. For Jews, this meant, for example, taking an oath on the books of Moses. But forms of the Jewish oath that developed in German lands from the late 13th century, in particular the second group of the Schwabenspiegel manuscripts from the last 2 decades of the 13th century, also often included degrading elements, such as the obligation of the Jew taking the oath to stand on the skin of a pig. Such humiliation was to remind the Jews of their inferiority compared to Christians. In the Hungarian case, it is already significant that Jews were not barred from other means of proof, such as witnesses and duels that were open to Christians as well. So it shows the level of integration to open these forms of proof. Moreover, the degrading elements that were apparent in some of the other texts were not introduced in Hungary into the Jewish oath. Coleman's decretum about the Jews between 1104 and 1116 already referred to their oath according to the law of the Jews that could be used to disculpate someone who was accused of theft and had only Jewish witnesses. So it was the Jewish witnesses who were taking the oath. Now, such a means of proof was not fully equal to other means, but it was better than having no proof at all. So if you only had Jewish witnesses who took this oath, that would result in paying the fine for theft 4 times. So it didn't fully disculpate someone, but it meant paying this fine 4 times instead of 12 times, which would happen if you had no witnesses at all. King Béla's privileges elaborated on the meaning of the Jewish oath to be taken on the books of Moses, so he mentions that explicitly, and mentioned no degrading aspects. By the early 16th century, István Verbőci, in his tripartitum, included the requirement for Jews to wear the Jewish hat and stand barefoot. So he starts incorporating some of these elements, probably influenced by the customs of German burghers in Hungary. But even then, the Jewish oath in the Kingdom of Hungary was not as humiliating as in some of the other contemporary areas of Europe. It signals that at the end of the Middle Ages, secular government was still using the peculiarly medieval form of integration without equality, guaranteeing a measure of protection. Indeed, King Béla IV's privileges were renewed by subsequent rulers, and the same kind of dynamics, privileges and protection given to the Jews in exchange for service to the king continued. A short-lived exception occurred during the reign of Louis the Great, so the middle of the 14th century, who expelled the Jews from his realm. Because Jewish settlement depended on royal permission, such permission could be withdrawn any time. Numerous expulsions from various European realms occurred in the later medieval period, including, of course, expulsions from whole kingdoms that were intended to be permanent. In the Hungarian case, the expulsion of about 1360 lasted for a short time, and after a few years, the Jews were allowed to re-enter the kingdom, and most of them seem to have gone to Austria and Czech lands, so not very far away, so they could return. The element of gain from this expulsion was not absent. When the Jews were permitted to return, they had to settle in a new area of the royal center, Buda, because their old houses had already been given away by the king to his men. Yet the primary reason for Louis the Great's expulsion of the Jews, according to contemporary chronicle accounts, was his Christian zeal rather than gain. He wanted to convert the Jews to Christianity, but they stubbornly resisted. Now, some modern scholars discount this and search for the true reason of this expulsion in Europe-wide persecutions due to the plague, so the Black Death, which led to all kinds of accusations against the Jews of poisoning wells and sort of causing this Black Death. But this skepticism, I think, is misplaced, because later on in Poland, he became king of Poland as well, Louis the Great also tried to convert the Jews. Now, of course, he may have interpreted the plague as some kind of divine sign that he should intensify his missionary efforts, but we have no information about that. While this expulsion was an exceptional detour from the usual pattern of the political authorities' relations to Jews in Hungary, a new element was introduced in the course of the late medieval period into the relationship of rulers and the Jewish inhabitants of the realm. While Jews continued to be useful to rulers in economic roles and received protection in return, so even the last King of Hungary before the Ottoman conquest, Louis II, at the beginning of the 16th century, still protected the Jews, and this also entailed protection against arbitrary urban taxes to ensure their revenues for himself. Nonetheless, political motivations now sometimes led kings temporarily to withdraw their protection from the Jewish communities. The kings were at times willing to sacrifice Jewish goods to pacify influential groups or to benefit in economic terms. Rulers could use their power to cancel debt to Jewish moneylenders as a bargaining chip. So, killing letters, as it was called, that is canceling either interest or the full loan amount due to Jews, was offered in exchange for services or other benefits. For example, King Sigismund in the late 14th, early 15th century, and King Matthias in the second half of the 15th century, allowed the repayment to be delayed or canceled the interest several times at the demand of towns, and they benefited from urban support against the nobility. John Hunyadi, a national hero in the wars against the Ottomans and governor of Hungary in the middle of the 15th century, received weapons and warriors from Pozsony, modern Bratislava, in 1449, and released the citizens from all debts to Jews in exchange. As royal financial difficulties increased, methods against the Jews turned harsher. Władysław II, end of the 15th, early 16th century, ordered the imprisonment of the Jews of Sopron until they gave him the loan, as he called it, of 400 forints that he had demanded. And in practice, very often, while he gave privileges to the Jews, he could not protect them against urban legislation that excluded Jews from professions tied to membership in various guilds, such as being a tailor, for example. The king also increasingly allowed towns to handle cases involving Jews. These cases theoretically should have been reserved for royal jurisdiction, but this was handed over increasingly to the towns. Louis II's widow, Queen Mary, while also taking money from Jews, backed urban attempts by Pozsony and Sopron to expel the Jews while keeping their property and canceling their debts. So we can see a kind of decline, to some extent, of Jewish status in the late medieval period. Nonetheless, throughout the entire medieval period, the link between Jews and royal power was maintained, even if it was changing towards the end of the period. Rulers regulated Jewish status, and while there was ecclesiastical, noble, and increasingly urban pressure on them in this respect towards increasing exclusion, so towards discrimination and arbitrary economic measures, overall, they tended to follow the route of integrating Jewish communities into the realm through royal protection, while setting them apart as Jews who were therefore also at the mercy of royal goodwill. That is evident in 3 examples that were emblematic of the special ties between Jews and the king. These were the renewal of King Bela IV's privileges during the 14th and 15th centuries, the institution of a representative of the king with jurisdiction over the Jews, and the Jewish ceremonial role during royal entries. The privileges were regularly renewed, and without them, without royal protection, Jews would have been easy prey. The Iudex Iudeorum, judge of the Jews, first appeared in Bela IV privileges, but only from the 1360s can they be traced in practice. The office of the judge of the Jews was granted to the highest official of the realm who dealt with financial matters, the so-called camerarius. So this was an official of the king, and he was now to judge cases between Jews and Christians. In royal towns, the town judge filled that role. Although at the end of the 14th century, kings gave rights over Jews to landlords from the high nobility, literally this was called the right to keep Jews, with full power over them, thereby withdrawing them from the jurisdiction of the judge of the Jews, in 1436, King Sigismund decreed that Jews under lords must also pay tax to the king, thereby reversing the detachment of Jews from royal power. King Matthias then instituted a new system. He abolished this institution of the judge of the Jews and instead established a prefectus from among the Jews themselves, who was a leader of the Jewish community of Buda. This prefect was even called Prince or King of the Jews in contemporary sources. He was accountable to the royal treasury and was responsible for partitioning and collecting the tax of the Jews. In effect, therefore, one type of overseer was replaced by another, but this did not change the close association of the Jews to the king himself. Finally, the late medieval role of Jews at the welcoming of the king during ceremonial entries, the so-called introitus, giving gifts and taking part in the parade when the Jews also asked for and received the renewal of their privileges, was a visible enactment of the ties between Jews and kings. There are detailed descriptions of the Jews welcoming King Matthias Corvinus after his election and his entry to Buda in 1458 and again after his coronation. Now, the extent to which kings could or were able to offer protection in practice varied. Just two late medieval examples demonstrate that rulers were at times forced or were willing to sacrifice Jewish property to appease popular revolts. Antonio Bonfini, one of the humanist chroniclers at the court of King Matthias, wrote of such a popular revolt against the Jews at Buda in 1496. The rebel plundered Jewish houses, taking valuables, and when the Bishop of Eger tried to intervene, this just raised popular discontent because he was held responsible for recent taxes. In the end, the king, but only after several days, sent soldiers who immediately captured and executed some of the wrongdoers, putting an end to the revolt. Yet the king did not dare to oppose the people more for fear of fomenting further revolts. When the Jewish street of Buda was plundered in 1525, the Count Palatine, that was the kingdom's highest official, the representative of the king, intervened, but again only after several days, to save the Jews. Thus, popular discontent associated those in power with Jews and took vengeance on Jewish communities. At times, kings even allowed this safety valve to let off popular steam before intervening to protect Jewish property. Now, this was the flip side of royal protection, and you may ask what the difference between this and state-fomented anti-Semitism is. But I would argue that the distinction is significant. While royal power could allow discontent to be channeled against Jewish property, ultimately it was royal intervention that saved the Jews. Attacks were also very localized and not statewide. In the case of state-sponsored anti-Semitism, it was only either a change in central political will or outside pressure that could suspend the state machinery's active participation in destruction. In the medieval period, there are cases of a king wanting to make profit at the expense of the Jews, cases of a king bowing to ecclesiastical or popular pressure, of acting out of religious zeal. But there are no cases of a systematic recourse to anti-Judaism as a political tool in medieval Hungary. Rulers did not foster anti-Judaism out of political interest. As before, anti-Jewish rhetoric came from ecclesiastical circles, notably from sermons, and in the later medieval period from towns, which saw Jews as economic rivals. Kings at times espoused such anti-Jewish attitudes to some extent. At other times, combated them. But apart from Louis the Great's Christian zeal resulting in the short-lived expulsion, all the kings of Hungary continued the integrative pattern when it came to their policies towards Jews. The early modern division of the kingdom into three political units, and you can see it here. Habsburg Hungary, the Ottoman part of Hungary, and the Principality of Transylvania, which was independent but a vassal of the Ottoman state. Brought a change also for the Jews of Hungary, that is, the Jews of Habsburg Hungary. The Ottomans resettled some of the Jews from Hungary to the Ottoman Empire, but both there and in Ottoman Hungary itself, they were treated according to the Islamic precept of toleration for the so-called peoples of the book, or dhimmi, which meant the autonomy of Jewish communities and communal affairs, at the same time, however, also putting them in a kind of secondary status with special taxes. In the Principality of Transylvania, the earlier status of Jews continued, and then Prince Gábor Bethlen gave privileges to the Jews in 1623. These privileges were actually inspired by Ottoman practices, and they followed the suggestion of a Jewish doctor from Constantinople, Abraham Sassa. So these privileges granted to the Jews free trade in exchange for paying tax, protected Jewish religious practices, and granted the right not to wear distinctive signs. Jews in the part of the Kingdom of Hungary that came under Habsburg rule, however, saw a deterioration of their status. Ferdinand I allowed landholders to replace the royal treasury as the judicial authority over the Jews, who also had to pay tax to them. So the ties binding Jews to kings were loosened, and their usefulness to rulers was declining, although they still provided monetary revenues. And even in the 17th century, the figure of the court Jew, the Hofjude, played an important role in providing loans of money during the 30 Years' War. Rudolf I, in 1578, wished actively to encourage the emigration of Jews who had houses by doubling the amount of tax they must pay, not only Jews, but also Anabaptists. And Ferdinand III, in 1647, while legislating about the prohibition for Jews to rent customs duties, also stated that Jews were incapable to have the rights of the kingdom, they were infidels and endowed with no conscience. And this actually used legal terminology, the word incapax, which sort of conjures up notions of having no discretion, and links back to the long-standing Catholic topos of the irrational Jew. Such negative attitudes were inspired by Catholicism, and with the significance of the Counter-Reformation for the Habsburgs, not only Protestants but Jews also experienced the exclusionary drive that now overrode earlier patterns of policies from central political authority. So basically, Catholicizing became part of centralizing Habsburg power and therefore became a stronger element in relations to non-Catholics. The expulsion of the Ottomans and Habsburg kingship in Hungary meant that the tradition of the Counter-Reformation of the 16th, 17th centuries, spreading the Catholic faith, became a high priority of the rulers of Hungary. Count Leopold von Kolonich's reform program of 1688 advocated this also with respect to the Jews. If they were unwilling to convert, they should be removed from economic and social life. They would have no right to exchange money, to lease customs duties or lease land, and they'd have to pay heavy taxes. They were not to be allowed to settle on land reconquered from the Turks and were eventually to be removed from the whole kingdom. With hindsight, from the modern age, from our own age, the Count used hair-raising vocabulary. The kingdom is to be cleansed from such junk and harmful filth. So he actually used words reinigen, and Wust, and schädlich, and Unrat. Thus, like Louis I, the Habsburgs of the late 17th century were intent on the expulsion, elimination of the Jews as a program of the state, although in both cases, conversion to Christianity nullified state persecution. So this was still very much based on religious principles. Jews as Jews were not to be tolerated, but conversion to Christianity gave them sort of equality. Maria Theresa, who was Queen of Hungary from 1740 to 80, was also an advocate of restricting Jewish activities and saw them as a plague. Yet her state needed the Jews and their taxes. And so despite her personal antipathy, in the end, she allowed for continued Jewish life in Hungary. Indeed, starting in the 18th century and especially in the 19th, Jews became the main beneficiaries of capitalist development, which also then led to mass assimilation starting in the 19th century. With the waning of the Catholic imperative and rise of modernization with Joseph II, 1780 to 90, there was a radical change. Joseph II advocated both the education of his subjects and tolerance in matters of religion. Just as he ensured that the status of non-Catholic Christians was regulated, so too did he want to provide for the integration of Jews in a comprehensive manner. While he decreed in 1783 that Jews were not to be disturbed in their religious practices, and so, for example, he even ordered that in the guilds, Jewish apprentices had to be accepted, and their special dietary requirements were to be catered for and allowed, so that the guild masters should not interfere with that. At the same time, he tried to push a reform through that was to integrate the Jews by separating religion from everyday life. In other words, by secularizing and modernizing Jewish life from above. Jews were to undergo compulsory schooling in secular subjects. Without it, they would not receive the right to have a business, for example, either in Jewish schools to be set up or in the national schools, and they were indeed to be encouraged to send their children to the communal schools with Christians. They were also to adopt the languages of the country for all official business, that is, Latin, German, or Hungarian, because only documents in these languages would be accepted legally. Joseph reserved Hebrew for religious matters, but completely wanted to eliminate Yiddish, which he called Jüdisch Deutsch, and anything that was not pure Hebrew to be controlled by imperial appointees. Jews were also finally to adopt German family names. Now, I would like to use two types of examples to give you an idea of the differences between the integrative and the exclusionary drives prior to emancipation, vocabulary and the regulation of clothing. And by vocabulary, I mean the terms that are used to describe Jews by rulers or documents issued by the rulers. And in terms of the clothing, the kind of regulation that came again from above as to what Jews must or must not wear. The vocabulary for centuries was mainly religious, contrasting Jews and Christians, Judei and Christiani. That is how the laws of Ladislaus I, Koloman, Bela IV, and others used the terms. Converts were at times designated as formerly a Jew, now a Christian. Antonio Bonfini, in his Rerum Hungaricarum Decades, the very end of the 15th century, is rare in contrasting Hebrei, Hebrews, and Ungari, Hungarians. The terminology of Hebrews evokes biblical times and thus has religious connotations. And the story itself, where Antonio Bonfini uses this term, is clearly about religion. It is the story of Louis trying to convert the Jews. And Antonio Bonfini says that in order to convert the Jews, Louis the Great promised to treat them as Hungarians, pro-Ungaris, if they convert. How should we understand this usage of these terms? The ancient Hebrews were the chosen people. They lost that status when they refused to acknowledge the Messiah, according to Christian tenets, and Christians gained that status. That many peoples inhabited Christendom was commonly acknowledged. So conversion would ensure membership in the kind of local representatives in Hungary of Christendom. The classicizing tendency of a humanist, rather than incipient racism, was behind the choice of the term. Even in the later medieval period, it is more frequent to find the religious comparison, Jews and Christians, or occasionally status groups such as lords, knights, squires, and citizens, and Jews. So there you have legal statuses. This is from the late 15th century. Terminology can be also tied to the notion of a gens, a people. So you find gens Judaica, gens Hebraica, and Judaicae nationes homines, all used in Joseph II's decree. Now, such terminology can be used in integrative strategies of according group privileges. The terms, however, even if unwittingly, can be put in the service of exclusion when they stigmatize and carry negative connotations. After all, if the semantic field of the term Jew denotes slyness, stubbornness, blindness, and the like, can one wonder that sooner or later people who are fed this kind of daily fare will turn against the Jews? Yet in contrast, we should also recognize the modernity, but of course in a strictly temporal rather than value judgmental sense, of the contrast of Jew and Hungarian among citizens technically with equal rights. First, in such a context, Jew only makes sense when it is applied in line with racial laws devised in Nuremberg and in their wake elsewhere, including Hungary. It is not a term that denotes the religious affiliation of people because it includes those who are not religious. It includes those who would not consider themselves Jewish. It can only serve exclusion, even if the superficial message is one of protection or friendship. Such a binary division suggests that there are Hungarian citizens who are ethnically pure Hungarians and others who are not, who are Jews. That ethnic Hungarianness is a complete myth is well known. So is, of course, the racial Jew. The contrast has one meaning alone, and that is to suggest that some people defined by the state are more natural citizens or proprietors of the state than others. Clothing regulation was initially exclusionary, but came not from the ruler, but from the Catholic Church in Hungary. The idea derived from papal policy. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council decreed that there should be some kind of distinguishing clothing worn by Jews, because the Jews and Christians cannot be distinguished from each other, and so they have unwanted sexual mingling, and this distinguishing clothing was to prevent that. Now, this distinguishing clothing was soon interpreted as a demand for a distinguishing sign, and these were introduced in various European countries in different shapes. To Hungary, the sign was introduced late and by the insistence of a papal legate. The papal legate, Jacob Pecorari, Bishop of Praeneste, who compelled King Andrew II to take the oath of Berend in 1233 concerning the prohibition of non-Christian public office holding, also included in the oath the general promise to introduce distinguishing signs for Jews and Muslims. This clearly did not go into effect and was not even specified further what the sign was supposed to be. Philip, another papal legate who held a synod at Buda in 1279, prescribed the introduction of a red circle made of cloth sewn on the left side of the outer garment to be worn by Jews of both sexes when they went outside their home. This regulation, however, lacked royal support to such an extent that the deadline by which it was to be introduced was omitted from the manuscript. Indeed, there is no evidence of distinctive Jewish clothing or signs imposed on Jews in Hungary until 1421 in the law book of Buda. This was a German law book, and it was, of course, only effective in Buda. This prescribed a Jewish hat, red cape, and yellow circle. More generally, in the kingdom, evidence comes from the early 16th century regarding the requirement of wearing a cape for Jews. And I just want to show you, this is an example not from Hungary, but of a Jewish hat, and this from German lands, early 16th century, of this red circle and cape. An integrative use of clothing regulation came from Emperor Joseph II in the same regulation that I already talked about. He didn't simply wish this compulsory schooling and the other things I described, but also demanded the abolition of all distinguishing signs that had set Jews apart from others. Now, he did not mean the abolition of the Jewish hat or red circle or whatever. Instead, Jews were ordered to divest themselves of their beards and external signs of their religion, in exchange for which they were to be protected against every insult and harm. This last requirement on the shaving off of beards met with such vehement resistance that it was soon dropped. Now, this example also alerts us to the fact that integration itself must be contextualized in its own period and culture. King Bela IV promoted integration, as did Emperor Joseph II. The first, however, did it according to a common medieval pattern, giving privileges, that is, protection to the Jews, in effect providing a royal guarantee that they can practice their religion, trade, and enjoy safety in his kingdom while setting them apart as Jews. Joseph II, however, while allowing them religious freedom, wished to integrate Jews in terms of their language and culture. The two forms of integration are obviously very different from each other. Neither amounted to equality. I should also add that apart from the modern liberal agenda, even those who promoted integration contributed to maintaining the status of Jews as a group apart, and even if unwittingly, strengthened anti-Jewish feeling. Thus, Joseph II's decree, which is ordering the integration of the Jews, is full of expressions vilifying the Jews. Their inborn slyness and perfidy means that they may try to wriggle out of the demand for schooling. Their mistrust springs from their inborn partiality, and their well-known stubbornness poses a problem. Complete equality for the Jews, emancipation, became a political program in the 19th century. The liberal program represented by József Eötvös stood on the platform of equal civic rights for all citizens. It was hoped that the granting of rights would be followed by modernization, but in this case, voluntary rather than imposed from above. Others, such as Lajos Kossuth, demanded assimilation as the precondition of gaining rights. During the 1848-49 revolution, civic equality for Jews figured among the demands of some. In the end, emancipation was passed into law in 1867. From that time, Jews in Hungary had the same civil and political rights as Christian inhabitants. Yet, the state did not persist for long in the relative novelty of complete integration with the freedom of personal choice in matters of religion. With the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and the humiliating Treaty of Trianon, where the previously despised nationalities gained the favor of the victorious allies, the Hungarian government drew on anti-Semitic rhetoric in a new way. Now, such anti-Semitism, of course, already existed, but while it was at the most marginal in political life earlier, it now became state policy. Jews were identified with communists. Many of those who played a role in the Republic of Councils, or Soviet Republic of Hungary, in 1919, including the leader Béla Kun, were seen as Jews by anti-Semites. Now, just how Jewish these people were can be exemplified by Béla Kun himself, because his father was Jewish, although not a practicing Jew. His mother was not Jewish at all. He was raised in a secular way. He was schooled in a Calvinist college. So what makes him a Jew? Well, anti-Semites do. In the Horthy regime, therefore, it was the anti-Semitic construct of the Jew that was used to turn real Jews into scapegoats for all the ills of Hungarian society. Political anti-Semitism was used to divert popular anger from government policies that kept a large part of the population poor and the country hopelessly backward, depriving Jews of civic equality and rights, and eventually designating as Jews not the adherents of Judaism, but the descendants of Jewish parents, regardless of conversion, atheism, or self-definition. The Hungarian state used anti-Semitism as a political tool. The systematic fostering of anti-Semitism by the state, identifying Jews as the cause of all ills, fomenting hate, and creating a Jewish problem to be solved, was a novelty of the Horthy regime. It drew on pre-existing anti-Semitism for sure, but reinforced, fueled, and channeled it for its own ends. In the Horthy-era, one can find expressions of anti-Semitism as self-defense. Distorting history, members of the regime liked to point out that Jews had always presented a danger to the Hungarian state, and that already the medieval kings of Hungary recognized that. And their legislation, apart from the weak kings who were at fault, demonstrates their rightful anti-Semitism. Now, I just want to give you one example of a supposedly scholarly assessment, so on purpose, not a rabid right-wing pamphlet, but a solid academic example that demonstrates the extent to which political anti-Semitism penetrated the fabric of society. Bálint Hóman, one of the leading historians of the Horthy regime and also Minister of Religion and Education between 1932 and 38, wrote in his Hungarian Monetary History, 1000 to 1325, in 1916, that the leasing of royal income aimed at maximizing these revenues. The lessee could afford various smaller or greater malpractices because the king would ignore such abuse of powers in return for higher revenues. Therefore, the king made money minting a business venture when he leased it. But as soon as something became a well-remunerated business, the Jews, medieval Europe's financiers and bankers, immediately appeared. They who, as the consequences showed, made no matter of conscience concerning the exploitation of the lease in prohibited ways, could naturally increase the rent they paid to incredibly, sorry, there's a typo, but that's incredibly high amounts, and therefore it is no wonder that weaker kings in chaotic financial situations willingly relied on their services. Now, you can see that this is already a biased presentation, but it was reformulated in even starker terms, now encouraged by the open anti-Semitism of the Horthy regime. So, in his book on the economic policy of the kingdom under Charles Robert, published in 1921, Hóman asserted that Béla IV, having learned the sad lesson from the contracts concluded with unscrupulous Jewish and Muslim lessees of the royal treasury, contacted citizens whose wealth and character guaranteed their honest dealings as lessees. Charles Robert put nobles at the head of the mint to avoid the severe damage to the inhabitants of the country and disintegration of internal peace that, as it had happened due to the activities of the 13th century Jewish and Muslim lessees of the treasury. So now they become a kind of active enemy danger to the state. I wish to underline that I am not contrasting some rosy period of medieval or modern harmonious relations between Jews and Christians with 20th century exclusionary drives. There was despoiling, many types of exclusion, attacks, pogroms, blood libels in the Middle Ages and modern times, even when the ruler or government promoted integration. What was significantly different, however, was that in situations where anti-Semitism was mobilized centrally for political purposes, the outcomes were sweeping, so not the kind of localized phenomena that we have otherwise. To put it differently, whereas exclusion can happen no matter sort of what state policies are, with exclusionary state policies, of course, the outcome is guaranteed to be exclusion and sort of popular anti-Semitism. Now, integration through privileges, that is an independent legal status, even if it was based on protection in exchange for the benefits gained from Jews, was always fragile. But in the Middle Ages, it was the Catholic Church that was the main driver of anti-Judaism and not the state. Popular anti-Jewish feelings existed in most periods, but whether these could be translated into anti-Jewish practice depended increasingly on the state. Many of those who wished to exclude repeatedly claimed that they meant no physical harm. Such unintended consequences included the massacre of Jews by crusaders. Medieval ecclesiastics only wanted to teach the Christian population that Jews killed Christ, that they were stubborn and inferior to Christians. They did not intend for Jews to be murdered. We also find the idea in the modern period that the state only wanted a solution to the Jewish question and not the murder of its citizens. Yet, relentlessly driving home the message about Jewish inferiority, irrationality, culpability, Jews as a dangerous presence, in the end, leads to physical attack. As I mentioned at the beginning, I chose to focus on the attitudes of political authority towards the Jews. That does not mean that all the Jews were mere passive recipients of state policies. They were active agents, as attested, for example, in the Jewish elite's request for privileges to King Bela IV, the resistance to shaving off of beards under Joseph II, movements from the late 18th and in the 19th century demanding emancipation, and so on. Nor were the Jews of Hungary ever one homogeneous group. For instance, in the 13th century, the elites who moved freely between Austria and Hungary and gave loans to rulers were worlds apart from Jewish servants who were even willing to convert to Christianity to better their lot. Similarly, Jews were not unified in their attitudes to emancipation. Faced with the possibility of assimilation in the 19th and 20th centuries, some espoused it completely, while others rejected it. Thus, for example, Moses Schreiber, Sofer, the rabbi of Pozsony in the first half of the 19th century, formulated the Orthodox response to the challenge of assimilation. He wished to strengthen the religious fence to defend Jewish cohesion and advocated a strict rejection of religious change as well as of assimilation into non-Jewish society. The Torah prohibits innovation, he claimed. It would be a separate task to investigate Jewish initiatives and responses. Yet, as a minority, Jews defined either by voluntary identification or constituted by outside definition were always in a potentially vulnerable position. Political authority, to a large extent, determined the possibilities of and impediments to Jewish life by creating legal frameworks, by intervening, if necessary, to protect Jews, or, inversely, by unleashing hate speech and discrimination. Current government practice is unusual, even in the Hungarian context, and harks back to the Horthy regime, which was the only government that systematically built on anti-Semitism in its internal politics. The revival of government-fostered political anti-Semitism is in particular linked to the Horthy-era concept of the Christian national state. And there is a kind of harking back to that sort of terminology as well. No matter how often public denials are uttered, no matter how sometimes self-contradictory messages are sent intentionally or unintentionally, no matter how the government tries to play to different audiences by conveying varied messages, those who conjure up the vocabulary of us, Hungarians, versus them, Jews, harness anti-Semitism for political gain. Adults playing with fire cannot claim ignorance of the possible outcome of their actions. Likewise, no European politician in the 21st century can credibly claim to have no idea about the potential consequences of fostering political antisemitism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I think we have a little bit of time for discussion, so I open the floor for the discussion and ask you for your questions. And I will have a question to break the ice. Now, there are more questions from my side. It's because I had the feeling, nevertheless, you denied it. You nevertheless make a picture, give us an image of the Middle Ages Hungarian kingdom, that it's a more tolerant place than any other place in Europe towards the Jews. I had the feeling that it's a kind of it's a kind of a how to say, playing between exclusion and inclusion. But the question for me is, what is the difference to other European kingdoms? Is it really a better place for Jews? The next question, I make 3 questions now, and then maybe we break the ice. Because I didn't quite understand, there is a kind of, there seems to be a backslash from the early Middle Ages in the 14th century, when you pictures these riots in Buda, in the Jewish street, and it wasn't quite clear to me, why is this backslash? Why does the Hungarian kingdom turn to a little bit of more exclusion than in the period before? And the final question is, and 3 questions. Does this kind of recatholicization in the Habsburg kingdom mostly affect Protestants? I mean, in Austria, I know more about Austria, that, for instance, I don't know, 2/3 of the Corinthian population is really affected by this recatholicization. And it's, I don't know about, in Corinthians and so it's another group of Christian groups which is maybe more affected by that than the Jewish group. Please, just to break the ice.
Okay, so first question about toleration or tolerance. Well, I mean, in some Western European countries, the only minority that was non-Christian were Jews. So I think that made a huge difference. So if you compare Hungary, for example, to England, then I would say, yes, maybe the situation is better because at the end of the 13th century, the English king expels the Jews. So no Jews can remain in England, whereas in Hungary, it's a few decades before that the Jews receive privileges from King Bela IV. If you compare to the Iberian Peninsula, for example, so Castile, Aragon, Jews play not only much more important roles, but there is a much more kind of flourishing cultural life and so on. So no, I don't think one could sort of generalize in saying that Hungary is much better. I think the kind of specificity of the Hungarian position is this mixing. So Hungary in the Middle Ages is really in the contact zone between Catholicism, Byzantine Orthodoxy, and this world of the steppe, the world of the nomads. And there are influences from these 3 and people from all these places. So in that respect, Hungary resembles the Iberian Peninsula. It also resembles Rus, resembles Georgia. And in these countries, you actually find that the legal status of people may be, in fact, better because there are many more of these groups, and they're seen as contributing something to political power. So that's for the first question. The second question, sorry, was that about recatholicization? Or no, that was the third. Anyway, so recatholicization. I mean, I'm not an expert on the Counter-Reformation, but yes, of course, I mean, the primary target were the non-Catholic Christians, so the Calvinists in Hungary. I don't sort of know the statistics by heart. I think, in a sense, the Jews were almost, in a sense, accidentally affected, in the sense that the main drive was to ensure some kind of Catholic unity. So whoever did not fit into that, was now seen, in a sense, as a problem. Oh yes, the second question was about the late medieval period, so the 15th century, and why there's more exclusion. It's because of the changes in Hungarian society. The main carriers of this kind of anti-Semitism were the towns. So the urban, German and sort of non-German citizens saw the Jews as their economic rivals. They were trying to fill exactly the same positions, and they were trying to quite actively expel Jews and sort of do everything to eliminate this kind of economic competition, and they try to put pressure on the king to help them to achieve that. So it's in a nutshell.
Thank you very much for your fascinating paper. Thoughts come back and information came back I've read many, many years ago. So thanks for that. But even after reading many books about anti-Semitism, and my question goes beyond your topic of Hungary, even after reading many books about it, one question remains. How do you explain the step that has to be taken from anti-Semitism to mass murder and genocide?
Well, my own explanation is that if you, as I mentioned, if you're going to sort of constantly hammer home a certain kind of message, which is that a group of people are not really quite equal, or maybe not even quite human, because all these messages included elements of dehumanization. So the medieval Catholic message from the 12th century on was increasingly focused on the irrationality of the Jews. So the argument was that if they were rational human beings, they would recognize Christ. By not recognizing Christ, they prove that they're not rational. And if you're not rational, you're not fully human. So if you are going to, transmit this, and remember that, of course, this message was transmitted all the time from the pulpits, etc., people get used to the idea that, these people are somehow not only not, like us, but they're also not quite sort of protected in the same way. And then any kind of interest, any kind of, hatred, frustration. I mean, I think there, libraries are full of books about, very specific cases of what could trigger resentment, frustration with one's place in life, whatever, can then be taken out on the Jews. Many times it also entails very practical gain. So you can then take, either cancel the debt so you don't have to repay the money, or actually take the property of the Jews. And of course, it's not just Jews. I mean, if you look at Rwanda, if you look at the former Yugoslavia, I mean, you can see the same kinds of mechanisms, can go into effect between different groups of people. So, my explanation is that first, there are these layers of notions that, in a sense, dehumanize, that create the conditions. And if you then drop a match, the flames will go up.
Yes, I have actually a first question, which does not relate to your presentation. It is whether your first book, which I greatly admired, will ever be published in German, because I think it would be very, very good if we had it in German. Also, because the Hungarian translation, I think, is forbiddingly bad, and the Hungarian and the English version is forbiddingly expensive. So it's, which is a great pity. Having said that, I have two questions. The one is concerning your description of the situation in early modern times, so after 1525. And there I am wondering how what you describe as the royal charters or policy towards Jews in the so-called Austrian part of Hungary, whether we can really say that this kind of royal policy was actually carried out by the magnates in these areas, because I think that this is actually the period where the Jewish communities in Western Hungary do grow up. I mean, it is this funny coincidence that while there is a counter-Reformation persecution of Lutherans or say Protestants in general, at the same time Jewish communities seem to be thriving actually and have a lot of support from these families. So how do you explain that? That would be a question. And my second one is actually a historiographical one. How do you explain the fact that eminent Hungarian historians of the 50s and 60s, like György György, for example, who was writing about the period of, say, the Middle Ages, the 10th, 11th, 12th century, manages to omit all the references to Jews and Muslims, yeah? Which is a very strange thing, and I think, do you have an explanation for that? I would be very interested.
Well, I'd be delighted with a German translation, so Cambridge University Press would have to be your approach for that. But the first question, no, I don't think that was carried out in practice by the magnates. I think the significance is simply from the point of view of sort of high political authority detecting this change, but it doesn't mean that Jewish status in fact kind of deteriorated at the time. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you. The second, the historiography. I mean, I think that's true of many topics, that inconvenient topics are just not seen by historians. I mean, we're all influenced by, to our own times to choose our topics and to look for things. It's Mark Bloch, a medievalist I greatly admire, who wrote that the historian goes after human flesh. So, that's kind of the impetus of. So, I mean, I think it was just too inconvenient at the time to sort of try to engage, with this question. I mean, I didn't know Horthy personally from his works. It seems to me that his real sympathies were fairly right-wing. He probably couldn't have written the kinds of things he would have liked. I mean, I'm assuming, I don't have any proof, but he probably would have written more like Hohmann than, like Fugetti or whatever. So, he probably just preferred to ignore it instead.
Gut, dann möchte ich mich sehr herzlich bedanken für Ihr Kommen und mich auch bei der Referentin bedanken, sehr herzlich. Und ja, die deutsche Übersetzung des Buches, glaube ich, kommt auch dem Wiesenthal-Institut ein bisschen teuer, aber wir werden uns versuchen, darüber zu unterhalten jetzt noch. Die nächste Simon Wiesenthal-Lektion findet am 23. April statt. Sie werden wissen, am 22. April ist der Gedenktag an den armenischen Völkermord, der sich heuer zum 100. Mal jährt. Und aus diesem Grund werden wir auch dieses Völkermordes mit einem wissenschaftlichen Vortrag gedenken. Dominik Schaller von der Universität Würzburg wird den Vortrag halten unter dem Titel Zwischen Trauma und Leugnung, der Völkermord an den Armenierinnen und Armeniern im Ersten Weltkrieg. Nochmal vielen Dank und guten Abend.